Before I begin, if you've ever lived through betrayal like this, please leave a comment, and subscribe to StoryForge Network. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday, the kind of day that doesn't expect to be remembered, and I almost threw it away with the grocery flyers because it looked official in a boring way. The return address was my mother's handwriting, tight and slanted, the way it always got when she was trying to look calm. I stood in my apartment doorway with my key still in my hand, listening to the hallway radiator knock like it had something to confess, and told myself I'd open it later. Later turned into me standing at the kitchen counter with the kettle going cold, because there's a specific gravity to mail from your mother when you spent most of your life trying not to disappoint her. The paper inside was heavy, not thick exactly, but confident, like it had been printed with purpose. Across the top, in a bold, almost cheerful font, were the words, "Cost of raising a failure." Below that, line by line, were expenses that read like a ledger of my childhood. Medical bills from when I broke my arm at 7, piano lessons I quit at 11, summer camps I begged to go to and hated after 2 weeks, college tuition, the part she paid before I dropped out, rent for the year I moved back home, interest as if love accrues penalties. At the bottom, a total, $347,218.46. She had rounded it down in the email that followed because she always liked clean numbers. My first thought was that it was a joke, the kind she used to make when she was trying to hurt me and then pretend she was kidding if I reacted. My second thought was that jokes don't come itemized. I sat down because my knees had decided they didn't want to negotiate with the rest of me anymore, and I read it again and again. The kettle clicked off, the radiator went quiet, and for a moment my apartment felt like a held breath. My name wasn't on the bill. It didn't need to be. The subject line of the email was simply, "We need to talk." We had been needing to talk for years, but this felt like a different category of needing. I closed the laptop and stared at the wall where I'd been meaning to hang a picture. I thought about calling my brother, but we don't have the kind of relationship where you call to say, "Is this real?" He moved 3 states away and became very good at being busy. I thought about calling my mother, but I could already hear her voice, the careful calm, the way she says things that are meant to sound reasonable and land like stones. Instead, I called my grandmother. I hadn't planned to. My hand just went there, like it remembered a number my head was pretending to forget. She answered on the 3rd ring, as she always does, with my name said like a question that hopes it's also an answer. I didn't tell her about the bill right away. I told her about the weather, about the radiator, about how the city had finally fixed the sidewalk in front of my building, and I still stepped over a crack that wasn't there anymore. She listened, because that's what she does, and then she said, "You sound like you're standing in a doorway." I laughed once, the kind of laugh that's more of a leak than a sound, and told her I had mail. There was a pause, and then she said, "Read it to me." So I did, the words turning small in my mouth as I tried to make them fit in a space where love is supposed to live. She didn't interrupt. When I finished, she said, "Your mother has always been good at numbers." I waited for the rest. "She's never been good at people," my grandmother added. I wanted her to tell me it was a mistake. I wanted her to say my mother was scared and would apologize. Instead, she asked me if I could come by that weekend. "I have something to show you," she said. "It's not going to make this smaller, but it might make it clearer." I asked her what it was. She said, "It's a story your mother doesn't like to tell." That night, I slept like someone had taken my mattress and replaced it with a map of every wrong turn I've ever made. I kept seeing the total at the bottom of the page, the way you see a bright sign after you close your eyes. In the morning, I went to work and pretended to be a person who had not just been invoiced for existing. My boss asked if I could take on an extra project. I said yes, because I always say yes, and because some part of me still believes you can outwork a sentence someone wrote about you. On my lunch break, I reread the email, this time noticing the careful way my mother had framed it as a chance for accountability. She used words like responsibility and closure. She didn't use words like love. I typed 3 different replies and deleted them. The first was angry and accurate and would have started a war that would last another decade. The second was apologetic and false and would have fed a story about me I'm tired of carrying. The third just said, "I'm coming to see Grandma this weekend." I sent that one. The bus to my grandmother's town always smells like coffee and old paperbacks, and I like to sit by the window and pretend I'm going somewhere brave. The fields went from winter brown to a softer green as we drove, and I tried to remember a time when my mother and I weren't a series of negotiations. When I was small, she used to braid my hair too tight and tell me beauty requires patience. I learned early that patience was another word for holding still while someone else decides who you're going to be. My grandmother's house sits back from the road like it's taking a step away from traffic, and the porch boards creak in a way that sounds like a greeting. She hugged me the way she always does, with a hand on the back of my head like she's checking to make sure I'm still here. We made tea, because everything important in that house happens around tea, and then she went to the hall closet and brought back a shoebox. It was heavier than it should have been for its size. She set it on the table and didn't open it right away. "Your mother thinks money is a language," she said. "It isn't. It's a tool, sometimes a weapon." She slid the box toward me. Inside were letters, not a few, dozens. Some were in my mother's handwriting, some in my grandmother's, some in a careful script I recognized as my grandfather's from the cards he used to send before he died. On top was a small notebook with a rubber band around it. "These are not for you to carry," she said, "but I think it's time you know what they say." I opened the notebook first. It was a list, because of course it was. Dates, amounts, notes in the margins. But this list wasn't about me. It was about my mother. Medical bills from when she was young, a loan my grandparents took to keep her in school, rent she covered when she left home and came back twice. "Your mother didn't fail," my grandmother said, as if she could hear the thought forming. "She struggled, and then she learned to pretend she didn't." I flipped through the letters. There were arguments on paper, the kind that look calmer because they have to fit in envelopes. There were apologies that never quite landed. There were receipts for help that no one had ever called help. "She hates owing," my grandmother said. "She hates needing, so she keeps score instead." I told her about the bill. She nodded like she'd been expecting that shape of news. "I told her once that you don't get to charge interest on love. She told me I didn't understand the real world." My grandmother looked at me, and there was a sadness there that felt old and patient. "Here's the part she won't like," she said, and pulled out a folded piece of paper from the bottom of the box. It was my grandfather's handwriting. It was a will, or part of one, or a note meant to be folded into one. "For the children," it said, and then, not as a debt, as a start. He had left money for both my mother and I in separate lines with the same amount. The dates were from years ago. "She never told you," my grandmother said. "She took hers and called it fairness. She never touched yours. She said she'd hold it until you proved something." I felt something in my chest loosen and tighten at the same time, like a knot remembering it could be a bow. "How much?" I asked. My grandmother told me, and the number was big enough to change things and small enough to make a point. "It's not a reward," she said. "It's a reminder that someone thought you were worth planning for." I didn't know what to say. I sat there with my hands around a cup that had gone cold, and I thought about my mother's email and the way she had rounded the total like she was being generous. "She's going to be angry," I said. "She's already angry," my grandmother replied, not unkindly, "but anger isn't the same as being right." She reached across the table and touched my wrist and said, "I told you I had something worse." "Worse than the bill?" "It's this," she tapped the letters. "It's the proof that she learned to turn fear into accounting, and I'm tired of pretending that's the same as love." I asked her what she wanted me to do. She shook her head. "I don't want you to do anything. I want you to know you don't owe your life to a spreadsheet." We sat in that quiet for a while, and then she said, "Your mother is coming over tomorrow. She thinks I'm on her side." I laughed because the idea of sides in a family always feels like a game with no winners. "She asked me to talk to you," my grandmother continued. "I told her I would. I didn't say how." I looked at the shoebox, at the notebook, at the folded piece of paper with my grandfather's careful handwriting. "Will you be here?" I asked. Of course, she said. This is my kitchen. We're going to have tea, and then we're going to tell the truth. That night, I slept in my old room, the one that still had a dent in the wall when I threw a shoe at a poster because I didn't know how to throw a sentence. In the dark, I thought about totals and lists and how easy it is to confuse care with control. In the morning, I went to work and pretended to be a person who had not just been invoiced for existing. My boss asked if I could take on an extra project. I said yes, because I always say yes, and because some part of me still believes you can outwork a sentence someone wrote about you. On my lunch break, I reread the email, this time noticing the careful way my mother had framed it as a chance for accountability. She used words like responsibility and closure. She didn't use words like love. I typed 3 different replies and deleted them. The first was angry and accurate and would have started a war that would last another decade. The second was apologetic and false and would have fed a story about My mother came in like she always does, with purpose first and greeting second. Her coat still on, her eyes already scanning the room as if she were looking for numbers that didn't add up. She hugged my grandmother with the careful efficiency of someone who counts seconds without meaning to, then turned to me and smiled in a way that felt practiced. "You got my email," she said, not a question. "I did," I replied, and the word felt too small for the space it had to cover. We sat. Tea was poured. The kettle made a small, brave noise and then went quiet. My grandmother waited longer than I expected before she spoke, like she was giving the room time to remember what honesty sounds like. "You brought your ledger," she said, nodding at my mother's bag. My mother stiffened, just a fraction. "I brought paperwork," she corrected. "It's not the same." "It is when you use it to keep score," my grandmother said, and then looked at me. "Show her." My hands found the envelope in my backpack without asking my head for permission. I slid it across the table. My mother's eyes flicked to the bold words at the top, and for a second, just a second, something like doubt crossed her face. Then it was gone. "It's not personal," she said. "It's accounting." "It's my name," I said. "It's my life." She sighed the way she does when she thinks she's being patient. "You left school," she said. "You moved back home. You cost money. I'm not saying that to be cruel. I'm saying it to be honest." My grandmother reached for the shoebox. She didn't open it yet. "Do you remember when you left home the first time?" she asked my mother. "You were 20. You said you'd never come back." My mother's jaw tightened. "I did come back," she said. "Twice." "You did," my grandmother agreed, "and we didn't send you a bill." "That was different," my mother said. "I had a plan." "So did they," my grandmother replied, gesturing at me without turning it into a label. "Plans change. That's not failure. That's living." My mother opened her bag and pulled out a folder like she was about to present a case. "I'm not here to argue about philosophy," she said. "I'm here to set boundaries. If we're going to have a relationship, I need accountability." "For what?" I asked. "For existing?" She looked at me then, really looked, and I saw something flicker there that I didn't recognize as anger. It was closer to fear, but she wore it like certainty. "For choices," she said, "for not finishing, for not becoming what you could have been." My grandmother finally opened the shoebox. She spread the letters across the table like a hand of cards. "For not becoming what?" she asked gently. "A person who never needs help?" My mother's eyes went to the notebook, then away. "That's not what this is about," she said too quickly. "It is," my grandmother said. "It always has been." She picked up the notebook and slid it to my mother. "These are the costs of raising you," she said. "The ones you never repaid, the ones we never asked you to." My mother's mouth opened, then closed. "That's different," she said again, and this time it sounded like a plea. "It's not," my grandmother said. "It's just older." I watched my mother's hands tremble as she flipped through the pages. She stopped at a line, then another. "You kept this?" she asked. "I kept everything," my grandmother said. "Not to charge you, to remember." My mother looked up at me. "You don't understand," she said. "I worked so hard not to need anyone. I can't watch you." She trailed off, and for a moment the room was full of things that weren't being said. "I can't watch you what?" I asked. "Be human?" She flinched, like the word had weight. "I can't watch you settle. I can't watch you div up." "I didn't give up," I said. "I changed." My grandmother cleared her throat, a small sound that somehow carried authority. "There's more," she said, and pulled out my grandfather's folded paper. She handed it to my mother first. My mother read it standing up because she couldn't seem to sit and hold it at the same time. When she got to the part with the amounts, her face went pale in a way I'd only seen once before, at a funeral that didn't go the way she planned. "You never told me," she said. "Not to me, not to my grandmother, but to the room." "I didn't need to," my grandmother replied. "You took yours. You decided what fairness looked like." My mother's voice got sharp. "I was going to give it to them when they proved they could finish something." The word proved landed like a gavel. "That's not what he wrote. He wrote, not as a debt, as a start." My mother laughed, a brittle sound. "You always thought he was a saint. He was a man," my grandmother said, "who knew that love isn't a loan." My mother looked at me then, and I saw the war she'd been fighting with herself for years. "You think this makes you right? You think money makes up for—" "No," I said, and surprised myself with how steady my voice was. "I think it makes your bill small." She sat back down like someone had taken the air out of her. "I don't want your money," I added. "I want you to stop telling a story about me that makes you feel safe." "I am trying to make you strong," she said. "You taught me to be careful," I replied. "Those aren't the same." My grandmother reached for the teapot and refilled all 3 cups, like she was resetting the table. "We're not here to decide who wins. We're here to decide what we keep." My mother stared at the steam. "I can't pretend it didn't cost anything," she said. "No one is asking you to. We're asking you not to send an invoice for love." There was a long silence. Outside, a car passed. A bird argued with itself. My mother finally spoke. "If I tear it up," she said, "what then?" "Then we talk," I said, "without totals." She picked up the envelope, looked at it, and tore it in half, then in quarters, then in pieces small enough to be confetti at a party no one was throwing. She didn't look triumphant. She looked tired. "I don't know how to do this," she said. "Neither did I. I learned by failing quietly and trying again." My mother's eyes filled, and she wiped them like she was annoyed at the inconvenience. "I'm scared," she said, and the room seemed to lean in. "Of what?" I asked. "Of you being okay without me." The honesty of it made my chest ache. "I don't want to be okay without you. I want to be okay with you." She nodded once like she was making a note. "What about the money?" she asked, not looking at me. "What about it?" my grandmother said. "It's theirs." My mother said I was holding it. "Then let go," my grandmother replied. My mother took a breath and said, "I will, but not like this, not as a prize, as help." "That's fine," I said. "I'll use it like a start." She almost smiled. Almost. We sat there for a while longer, talking about small things, like how the porch steps needed fixing and how the neighbor's dog had learned to open the gate. When it was time for my mother to leave, she hugged my grandmother and then me. It wasn't easy, but it was real. After she drove away, my grandmother and I washed the cups and put the letters back in the box. "She's going to try," my grandmother said. "Trying is a habit," I replied, and she laughed. On the bus home, I thought about invoices and starts and how families turn fear into systems. When I got back to my apartment, there was a message from my boss asking if I could meet about the extra project. I said yes. I also emailed my mother and wrote, "We can talk again soon. No ledgers." She wrote back, "No ledgers." It felt like a small, brave sentence. That night, I took out the shoebox I keep for my own proofs of living and added a piece of the torn envelope, not as a reminder of what she did, but of what she stopped doing. The week after the envelope became confetti felt like walking on a bridge you've just agreed not to test by jumping. Things didn't magically get easier, but they did get quieter in a way that made room for thought. At work, the extra project turned into a small team, and the small team turned into meetings that didn't end with me apologizing for taking up time. I noticed it the way you notice a new freckle, not because it changes everything, but because it means the sun has been doing something without asking. My mother called on Thursday and asked how my day was, not as a prelude to advice, just as a question. I told her about a spreadsheet that wouldn't behave, and she told me about a shelf she couldn't hang straight. We laughed, and the laugh stayed in the room instead of rushing out like it usually does. On Saturday, I went back to my grandmother's to help her sort through the attic, a place that smells like dust and decisions. We found a box of my school papers and another of my mother's, and for a while we sat on the floor comparing handwriting, the way you compare maps of places you've both been to but remember differently. She always wanted to be impressive, my grandmother said, holding up a certificate. She learned early that applause is easier to measure than peace. I thought about the bill again and how neat the numbers had been. "She's trying," I said. "I know," my grandmother replied. "That's how you can tell it's hard." In the attic, we also found my grandfather's old camera. It still had a roll of film inside, which felt like a dare from the past. We decided to get it developed, and for a few days I walked around thinking about images that had been waiting quietly for years to exist. When the photos came back, they were ordinary and beautiful. My mother at 17, laughing like she didn't know she was going to learn to keep score. Me at 6, missing a tooth and holding a kite like it was a promise. My grandparents at the kitchen table, tea between them, looking like they were in the middle of a conversation that never really ended. I brought the photos to my mother's the next weekend. She looked at the one of herself for a long time. "I forgot that girl," she said. "She's still here," I replied, and she nodded like she was writing it down somewhere inside. We made dinner together, which used to be a minefield and now was just a room with heat and knives and stories. She told me about a promotion she didn't take once because she was afraid she'd fail in public. I told her about quitting piano and how much I'd hated practicing and loved finishing. We didn't agree on everything, but we stayed at the table. That felt like progress you could put a hand on. A few weeks later, the money from my grandfather's note showed up in an account my mother had opened in my name. She sent a message that said, "Use it as a start." I didn't reply right away. I went for a walk and let the city remind me that beginnings don't need permission. I paid off a small debt. I enrolled in a class I'd been circling for years. I bought my grandmother a new kettle because hers had been making that brave noise for too long. When I told my mother, she said, "Good," and then, "I'm proud of you," like she was trying the words on to see if they fit. They did. That summer, my brother came to visit. He'd heard about the bill through the family grapevine and wanted to see if the house was still standing. We sat on my couch and ate pizza and talked about the ways we learned to survive the same room differently. "She made me invisible," he said. "She made you measurable." We laughed because sometimes naming a thing is the only way to stop tripping over it. He left with one of my grandfather's photos and a promise to call more. At work, the project shipped, and my boss said, "You did good," in a tone that didn't feel like a grade. I started keeping a small notebook of sentences that felt like starts. No ledgers, not alone, stay at the table. My mother came to one of my presentations and sat in the back and didn't take notes. Afterwards, she hugged me and said, "You were clear," like clarity was a kind of courage. My grandmother's health wobbled a little that fall. Nothing dramatic, just enough to remind us that time has its own accounting. I drove her to appointments, and we talked about recipes and my grandfather and the way fear makes people tidy their hearts too aggressively. One afternoon, she said, "Your mother called me." I waited. She asked how to say she's sorry without making it about herself. I smiled at the road. "What did you tell her?" I told her to say it once and then show it a lot. That winter, my mother did both. She said, "I'm sorry for the way I talked about you," without a speech, and then she showed it by asking before advising. by listening when I said no, by coming over with groceries and leaving before it turned into a favor you had to pay back. We still argued, we just didn't invoice each other for it. On my birthday, she gave me a small frame with one of my grandfather's photos inside. On the back, she wrote, "As a start." I put it on my wall where the unhung picture had been. Sometimes I still hear numbers when things get hard. Sometimes I still want to earn my place. But more often now, I remember that love isn't a spreadsheet and that fear doesn't get to be the only accountant in the room. I remember my grandmother's kitchen and the way truth sounds when it's poured like tea. I remember tearing paper and keeping a peace. And I keep moving, not to prove, but to live. By spring, the city had remembered how to breathe, and so had we, though not at the same pace. I noticed it in small ways first, like how my mother started asking what I thought before telling me what she thought, and how I started answering without rehearsing. The class I'd enrolled in met on Tuesday nights in a room that smelled like whiteboard markers and coffee, and I sat near the window because I liked seeing the reflection of the room layered over the street, like two lives learning to share the same space. The first assignment asked us to write about a moment we changed our minds. I wrote about the envelope and then didn't turn it in, because sometimes the most honest drafts are the ones you keep. Instead, I wrote about the day I quit piano and how I learned that finishing isn't the same as stopping. My instructor wrote, "You're good at making space for quiet." I taped that sentence inside my notebook, not as proof, just as a reminder. My mother called one evening and said she'd found a box in the garage with my name on it. "It's not a ledger," she added quickly, like she was swatting a habit. "It's your stuff." I went over the next Saturday. The box held old report cards, a broken watch, a stack of drawings I'd forgotten I'd made, and a small envelope with my grandfather's handwriting. Inside was a note that said, "For when you think you're late, you're not." I laughed and then sat on the floor and cried, because sometimes that's how timing works. My mother sat across from me and didn't try to fix it. That felt like a language we were both still learning. We talked about my brother, about how he'd always been good at leaving rooms before they could tell him who he was. She said she wanted to call him and didn't know what to say. "Start with his name," I suggested. She did. He called me later and said it was weird and good and that he'd probably come for the holidays. At work, I got asked to lead a small piece of the next project. The old part of me wanted to say, "Are you sure?" The newer part said, "Okay," and wrote down what I didn't know yet. On the first day of the lead, I stood at the front of the room and felt my hands try to remember a different story about me. I told them we'd figure it out together, and we did, mostly. When I told my mother, she said, "I'm glad they see you," and then corrected herself, "I'm glad you're letting them." That night, my grandmother called and said she'd made too much soup again. We ate it for 3 days and talked about the photos and the camera and how waiting doesn't always mean wasting. She told me a story about my mother at 12, hiding a bad grade in a library book. She thought if she could file it somewhere, it would become manageable, my grandmother said. She's been filing feelings ever since. I thought about the neat columns on the bill and felt a kind of tired compassion. Summer came in like a long exhale. My brother visited and slept on my couch and fixed a leaky faucet like it was an apology he could do with his hands. We went to see our mother together, and the 3 of us stood in the kitchen like people who had learned different dialects of the same silence. She made too much food. We stayed. We didn't solve anything in one afternoon, but we said names and told small stories and let the space be what it was. Later, my brother said, "She's trying not to count us." I said, "We're trying not to count her attempts." We laughed, and it felt like a truce you can live inside. I used some of the money to buy a used desk and put it by the window. I didn't tell my mother right away. When I did, she said, "Send a picture," and then, after a beat, "Thank you for telling me." The class ended, and I signed up for another one without making it a referendum on my worth. At work, the project shipped again, and this time I let myself feel good about it without turning that feeling into a debt I'd owe tomorrow. My grandmother's health steadied, and she started a small garden in the patch of dirt she'd always meant to use. We planted tomatoes and basil, and she said you can't rush roots, like she was talking to more than the plants. My mother came by one afternoon with a box of books she said she was done carrying. "You don't have to take them," she said. I took them anyway. We sat on the porch and watched the neighbor's dog fail at catching a tennis ball. She laughed, and the laugh stayed. In August, there was a family reunion, the kind with name tags and too much potato salad. I almost didn't go. Old habits have good memories. My grandmother said, "Go for 10 minutes, leave if you need to." I went for an hour. My mother introduced me to someone as my kid, not as a project. My brother told a story about our childhood that didn't turn us into punchlines. An aunt I barely remembered said, "You look happy," and I didn't argue. On the drive home, my mother said, "I used to think love was something you could organize." I waited. She said, "I'm learning it's more like weather. You can prepare, you can't control." I said, "I'm learning not to bring an umbrella to every conversation." She smiled like she'd written that down. In September, my boss asked if I wanted to apply for a role that would have terrified me a year ago. I said yes, and then went for a walk and let my hand shake and then stop. My mother wrote me a note that said, "No matter what happens, I'm proud you're trying." I put it next to my grandfather's. My grandmother sent a text that said, "Remember, not alone." On the day of the interview, I wore the watch that doesn't work and kept time anyway. I didn't get the role. I also didn't turn that into a verdict. When I told my mother, she said, "Do you want advice or ice cream?" I said ice cream. We ate it on the porch and talked about nothing important and everything else. That fall, the radiator started knocking again, and I realized I was listening to it like an old friend. I kept the piece of the envelope in my shoebox and added a note that said, "This is where the story changed." Sometimes I still feel the urge to itemize my life to justify the space I take, but more often I remember a kitchen table, a shoebox, a folded note that said start, and a woman who learned to tear paper instead of people. I remember that courage can look like staying and like leaving, and both can be honest. When winter came, my brother called more. My mother asked more questions and answered fewer with numbers. My grandmother's garden slept under a thin sheet of frost like it was keeping a secret it would tell in spring. And I kept writing, not to prove anything, but to keep the door open. October arrived with that particular light that makes everything look like it's deciding whether to stay. The desk by my window caught it in narrow stripes, and I learned to write in between them, as if the day were teaching me about margins. I started a small routine: coffee, 10 minutes of nothing, then a page that didn't have to be good. The page was often a list: what I noticed, what I feared, what I could probably do anyway. My mother called one morning to tell me she'd scheduled a meeting with a financial counselor. "Not because of you," she said quickly, then paused. "Because of me." I said, "I'm glad," and meant both parts. She told me she'd found another copy of the bill in a drawer and had shredded it, this time without ceremony. "Paper is lighter than it looks," she said, surprised. My grandmother came by with basil cuttings and instructions that were mostly metaphors. We planted them in mismatched mugs on my windowsill, and she said, "If it droops, it's asking. If it turns yellow, it's tired. If it grows, don't take credit too fast." I wrote that down. At work, a junior teammate asked how to talk in meetings without apologizing for breathing. I said, "Try speaking like you're leaving the door open for questions, not permission." She tried it, and it worked, and I felt the odd relief of passing along something that had been handed to me by accident. My brother sent a picture of a leaky faucet he'd fixed in his own place with the caption, "Practicing apologies." We started trading small repairs like postcards. In November, my mother invited me to a community lecture about budgeting and anxiety. We sat in the back and took notes like students who weren't trying to impress each other. On the walk home, she said, "I used to think I could insure you against pain." I said, "I used to think pain was a bill you could dispute." We laughed, and the laughter didn't ask for proof. The holidays crept up the way they always do, like a question that pretends to be a plan. We decided to keep it small. My grandmother made soup again, and my brother brought bread that looked like it had a story. My mother brought nothing but herself and a new habit of asking before offering. We set the table, and for once, no one counted chairs like they were a test. After dinner, my grandmother asked for the camera. She took a picture of us holding mismatched mugs, and the flash caught my mother mid-smile, surprised by it. "Keep that," my grandmother said, and handed me the print like a receipt you actually want to save. December brought the interview results for another role I tried for, and this time the email started with, "We'd like to talk." It wasn't a promise, but it was a door. I told my mother, and she said, "Do you want to practice?" We sat at my kitchen table with index cards and took turns asking and answering. She listened more than she spoke. When she did speak, it was to say, "That answer sounds like you." I went in wearing the same broken watch because sometimes you keep a ritual to remember what time isn't. I got the role. The raise wasn't dramatic, but the responsibility was. I walked home and called my grandmother first. She said, "Good, now plant something." My brother sent a string of celebratory tools emojis. My mother cried and then said, "I'm proud of you," and didn't add a clause. The first week in the new role, I made mistakes. I owned them. The world didn't end. I started a folder called Not Evidence, where I put compliments and good reviews and thank you notes, not to hoard them, but to stop using them as currency. My mother started sending recipes with notes like, "No pressure," and I believed her. In January, she asked if we could go through some old boxes together. We did it on a Saturday with music on and a rule: if it made us argue, we'd take a break. We found the old report cards and the drawings and the watch's original box. We found letters she'd never sent, some to me, some to herself. She didn't ask for forgiveness like it was a transaction. She said, "I'm sorry," like it was a direction. We put the letters back in a box labeled "Finished, Not Closed." I liked that. The city got quiet under snow, and my grandmother's garden slept like it was practicing patience. One night, my mother called and said, "I did something." The pause was old. Then she said, "I set up a small account for you. Not a gift, not a loan, a boundary for emergencies." I said, "Thank you," and then, because we're learning, "I don't plan to need it." She said, "That's the point." In February, my brother visited again and fixed a window that wouldn't close. We drank bad coffee and talked about the kind of fathers we might be if we ever were. He said, "I try not to keep a ledger." I said, "I try to keep a calendar." He nodded like that was a difference that mattered. At work, I led a meeting that went sideways and then back again, and I realized I wasn't narrating my failure while it happened. That felt like freedom with a small f. My grandmother called to say the basil was thinking about waking up. My mother called to say she canceled a subscription she never used and felt oddly brave. I started writing longer pieces, not for class, not for proof, just because some stories want air. I wrote about a bill and a box and a kitchen table and a woman who learned to count in different ways. I didn't show it to anyone. March came back like a promise that doesn't rush you. We went to the garden and turned the soil and found that the frost had kept some secrets and given some back. My grandmother said, "See, not everything needs a receipt." My mother brought lemonade and sat on the edge of the bed like she was waiting for a bus. We talked about my job, about my brother, about nothing that needed to be tallied. On the walk home, she said, "I don't think of you as a cost anymore." I said, "I don't think of myself as a balance." We stopped at a crosswalk and waited for the light like people who had learned that waiting isn't a verdict. April arrived with a draft through the windows and a stack of calendars that still smelled like ink. At work, the new role stopped feeling like a borrowed jacket and started to fit the shoulders I'd been pretending not to have. I learned the rhythm of decisions that don't announce themselves as important until after you make them, and I started keeping a small notebook for the kind of wins that don't show up in metrics, the meeting that ends 10 minutes early because everyone understands each other, the email that says thank you without needing a reply, the quiet moment when a teammate stops apologizing for existing. My mother began leaving voice notes instead of texts, little weather reports from her days, and sometimes she'd say, "I'm practicing listening," like it was a language. My grandmother's basil woke up and made a show of it, green like it had kept a promise. We trimmed it and put it in soup and pretended we weren't proud. My brother sent me a picture of a bookshelf he built that leaned just enough to look like it had a story, and he wrote, "Progress is a kind of furniture." We started planning a small trip to the coast, the three of us, my grandmother insisting on bringing a thermos and a mystery novel she would never finish. The idea of being together somewhere neutral felt like a bridge we were building from both sides. In the meantime, my mother asked if she could come to one of my presentations, to sit in the back, she said, and not count anything. She came and took notes anyway, but they were about phrases she liked and questions she wanted to ask later. Afterwards, she said, "You sound like you trust yourself," and I didn't know how long she'd been listening for that. We went for coffee and she told me about the counselor, about how they were working on the part of her that turned fear into invoices. "I used to think responsibility was the same as control," she said. "Now I think it's closer to attention." I told her about the folder I keep called Not Evidence, and she laughed like she was meeting me again. In May, the coast was windy and kind, and we rented a small place that smelled like salt and old books. My grandmother woke up early and wrote postcards to herself. My brother walked the shoreline like he was counting footsteps instead of debts. My mother stood at the window the first night and said, "I'm going to try not to manage this." She did, mostly. We cooked badly, told stories we hadn't told before, and let silence be a guest instead of a problem. One afternoon, we found a thrift store and bought a broken watch because it matched mine, and my grandmother said, "Two wrong times make a conversation." We took a picture and no one asked who would keep it. On the drive home, we talked about ordinary things, and I noticed how ordinary felt like a victory. Back at work, a project went sideways in a way that made my old instincts reach for a ledger. I felt the familiar itch to turn the setback into a sentence about myself, but instead I wrote 3 emails, one asking for help, one offering a fix, one saying thank you in advance. The project recovered. My manager said, "Good catch," and I didn't add a footnote. My mother sent me a recipe that started with, "If you want," and my grandmother sent a photo of the garden with a caption that read, "Account settled, sunlight." In June, my brother told us he was thinking about going back to school. "For what?" my mother asked, then caught herself and rephrased. "For what does it feel like?" He said, "For learning how to learn without asking permission." We clinked glasses to that. My mother started volunteering at a community center, helping people organize paperwork, and she came home with stories about the way numbers can hide kindness. "I'm trying to be useful without being heavy," she said. I wrote more, sometimes late, sometimes badly, and I stopped treating that as a crime. One night I found the old bill in a folder I thought we'd finished with. I didn't tear it up. I scanned it and saved it under a new name, Before. Then I put it away and washed the dishes. The coast called us again in July, but we stayed home and learned the neighborhood instead. We hosted a small dinner where my mother didn't overcook anything, and my brother fixed a chair that wobbled, and my grandmother told a story about a train she never took. Someone asked what I did, and I said, "I listen for a living," which felt truer than my job title. The heat made us slow, and the slowness made room. My mother asked if she could read something I'd written. I said yes, and watched her read like she was holding something fragile. She didn't praise it. She said, "This sounds like you letting the page breathe." That was better. In August, my manager asked me to mentor someone new. The first meeting, the person apologized for their questions, and I said, "Questions are a kind of work." We made a list that didn't look like a ladder and decided that was okay. My grandmother's garden gave up tomatoes like it was paying interest. My mother brought over jars and said, "I'm learning to store what we can't eat all at once." We laughed at the metaphor and then used it anyway. One afternoon, she asked me about my father. We hadn't talked about him much, not because it was forbidden, but because it felt like a room we didn't have to walk through to get where we were going. He would have liked your job, she said, then corrected herself. He would have liked that you like it. I nodded and felt something loosen. September came back with that same deciding light, and I noticed I wasn't afraid of margins anymore. We went through another box and found a tape from a long-ago reunion, the one that started all of this, and we didn't play it. My mother held it like a relic and then put it back. We already heard it. We don't need to keep listening for the same lesson. At work, we launched a project that felt like a shared breath, and when it went live, I closed my laptop and walked home instead of refreshing the page. My brother sent a picture of his acceptance letter. My grandmother sent a picture of the garden with a caption that read, "Account settled, sunlight." In October, I gave a talk at a small conference and mentioned offhand the idea that attention is a form of care. Afterward, a woman came up to me and she said she was trying to stop keeping score with her daughter. We talked about gardens and notebooks and how some debts are really just stories that forgot how to end. I didn't give advice. I told her what worked for me and left space for her to translate. On the train home, I wrote in my notebook, "Progress is when the ledger becomes a calendar." My mother called to say she donated some old paperwork and kept only what told a story she still wanted to tell. My grandmother called to say the frost was practicing. My brother called to say he was nervous and excited in equal parts. We met for soup and bread and sat in a line like punctuation. No one counted anything. When I got home, I opened the folder called Not Evidence and added a new note, "Spoke without apologizing." Then I closed it and didn't look for proof that it mattered. The world kept being the world with its small invoices and big silences, and I kept choosing to pay attention instead of interest. November arrived like a letter you don't open right away because you already know it will change something. The air had that thin clarity that makes every sound feel closer, and I found myself walking more, listening to the city practice winter. At work, the new hire I'd been mentoring led a meeting on her own, and when she finished, she didn't look for permission in the room, she just waited for questions. I wrote, "This is how it looks," in my notebook and underlined it twice. My mother started sending me photos of the community center bulletin board where someone had written in crooked marker, "Thank you for helping me breathe." And she added, "I didn't know paperwork could do that." My grandmother called to remind me that frost is not a verdict, it's a pause, and that plants understand pauses better than people. My brother sent a picture of his first week's reading list and said, "I already feel behind." And I said, "That's the beginning of learning, not the end of it." We planned a small Thanksgiving that would not try to fix anything, only to feed us. The morning of, my mother arrived with a pie that looked like it had a story, and my grandmother arrived with a coat that smelled like wood smoke. We cooked together without assigning jobs like debts. At the table, someone asked what we were grateful for, and it didn't turn into a ledger. My mother said time, and my brother said second chances, and my grandmother said quiet, and I said attention. We ate and didn't argue and didn't pretend that was a miracle, only a practice. After dishes, my mother asked if I would walk with her. The street was cold and kind, and she said, "I keep thinking about that bill, not because I want to justify it, because I want to understand what I was afraid of." We walked past a window with plants in it and paused like it was a gallery. "I was afraid you'd leave and I wouldn't have anything to show for it," she said, as if people are returns. I said, "I was afraid you'd never see me unless I could be counted." We stood there until the light changed, and then crossed like people who had learned to look both ways. In December, I found a small envelope in my mailbox with my grandmother's handwriting. Inside was a photograph from the coast, the three of us blurry in motion, and a note that said, "Motion is proof enough." I put it on my fridge. At work, I got asked to join a long-term project that would take a year. The timeline felt like a promise you make to yourself and keep by showing up. I said yes, and then went home and cooked something simple and didn't treat it like a reward. My brother came over with a stack of index cards and said, "Teach me how you study now." We sat at the table and made a system that was more calendar than ledger. My mother brought over jars, and we put away the last of the tomatoes like they were letters to the future. She told me she'd been thinking about writing to me, not an apology, not an invoice, just a story. I want to tell it without keeping score, she said. I said, I'll listen. The first snow came quietly and made the city look like it had chosen a simpler font. My grandmother's basil finally gave up, and we thanked it like it had been a guest. January arrived with resolutions that we didn't list. My brother went back to school with a backpack that made him look younger, and my mother drove him and didn't narrate the drive. At work, the long-term project began with a meeting that ended with more questions and answers, and I felt steady in that. One evening, my mother asked if she could come by. She brought a thin notebook and sat on my couch like she was waiting for a bus that would not arrive. She read to me. The story was about her own mother and money and the way fear can make you tidy the wrong things. It was about me, too, but not like a balance sheet. When she finished, she said, I don't want to be the kind of person who hands you a story and waits for forgiveness. I just want to tell it. I said, thank you for telling it. We sat with the quiet and didn't rush to make it useful. February was busy and kind of gray. The project at work hit its first real snag, and the room filled with that old electricity that means someone wants to count something. I said, let's write down what we know and what we don't know. And we did, and the panic found less to hold on to. My manager said, good framing, and I didn't turn it into a verdict. My brother called to say he'd failed a quiz and didn't feel like a failure. Progress, I said, and meant it. My grandmother called to say the frost was loosening its grip. My mother sent me a voice note that started with, I listened today, and ended with, it helped. In March, we went back to the garden and found green where we'd learned to expect it. We planted something new, not basil this time, something sturdier. My grandmother said, different seasons ask different questions. My mother asked if we could listen to the tape. Not the reunion one, but a new recording she'd made for herself, just a list of things she was afraid of and things she was learning. We sat at the kitchen table and listened to her voice try not to rush. When it ended, she said, I don't need you to respond. I said, I don't need to. April brought a small award at work that came with a plaque I didn't know what to do with. I put it on a shelf, then moved it behind a plant. My brother came over and said, I like that you hide your trophies, and I said, they don't like the light. He laughed and then fixed a cabinet hinge. My mother started bringing soup again and didn't apologize for it. We talked about ordinary things and about my father in a way that made him not a shadow or a bill. We talked about the way families keep time in different units. May came back to the coast in memory only, but we planned a short trip for the fall, nothing ambitious. At work, the project started to look like something you could walk through. I mentored another person and learned that teaching is a way of being taught without the panic. My grandmother sent me a note that said, you don't owe the garden, you belong to it. I wrote that on a card and put it in my wallet where the old bill used to be. June brought heat and a small crisis that resolved with a meeting and not a ledger. My mother called to tell me she'd helped someone set up a budget and hadn't turned it into a sermon. She asked what they wanted their money to do. She said, they cried, then laughed. I said, that's a good order. We met for dinner and didn't count calories or costs. July came with light that stayed late, and I found myself staying late too, not at work, but on walks. I thought about the word failure and how it once felt like a surname. I thought about the way my mother's story had changed its ending without pretending the middle didn't happen. I thought about my grandmother's garden and my brother's bookshelf and my own notebook. In August, I got an email from a stranger who said they'd heard me talk and were trying to stop keeping score with their son. I wrote back and said I was still learning, and that might be the point. We planned the fall trip. My mother booked a place and then asked if it was okay. I said yes and meant yes. September arrived with its margins again, and this time I filled them with plans that didn't need proof. One evening, my mother asked, what do you want for your birthday? I said, a walk. She said, okay. We walked and talked and didn't try to summarize. October showed up with leaves like receipts you can't return, and I realized I hadn't looked at the old bill in months, not because I was avoiding it, but because it had stopped being a mirror. The story was still there, but it had an ending that didn't need a total. I started to think about telling it out loud, not to prove anything, but to leave a light on for someone who might be counting in the dark. The idea of telling the story out loud stayed with me like a window left open on purpose. Not drafty, just enough air to remind you there's a world beyond the room. I didn't plan a big reveal or a clean arc. I planned a walk with my mother on my birthday, and a small trip with my grandmother and my brother in the fall, and a notebook that would keep the kind of notes that don't demand witnesses. The morning of my birthday, the city was kind in that ordinary way that feels like a gift when you stop asking for fireworks. We walked along the river and talked about nothing that needed to be kept. At a bench, my mother said, "I used to think stories were for settling things." She skipped a stone and watched it fail in the good way. "Now I think they're for carrying." I told her I wanted to share ours someday, and she nodded like she was giving me back something I'd always had. "Just don't turn it into a trial," she said. "Turn it into a window." In October, we went to the coast again, the same small place that smelled like salt and old books, and we brought fewer plans than last time. My grandmother woke up early and made tea and wrote postcards to people she might never send them to. My brother read on the porch and underlined things with a pencil he kept sharpening. My mother stood at the window and practiced not managing the weather. The first night, we cooked badly and ate anyway, and after dishes, we sat with the kind of quiet that doesn't ask for improvement. I took out my notebook and read a few lines I'd written about the bill and the box and the way fear can turn into furniture if you let it. No one interrupted. When I finished, my grandmother said, "Keep going." My mother said, "I'm listening." My brother said, "That sounds like us." The next day, we walked the shoreline and found a piece of driftwood that looked like a question mark, and my grandmother said, "See, even punctuation washes up." We took a picture and let the wind take credit. Back home, work became a series of rooms I knew how to stand in. The long-term project ended with fewer fireworks than expected and more relief. We celebrated with cake that leaned and coffee that was too strong, and I wrote thank you notes that didn't try to summarize. The new hire I'd mentored asked if I'd help her practice a talk, and we sat in a conference room and pretended the chairs were people who wanted to understand. I told her to leave space for breath. She did, and it worked, and I remembered the first time my mother had told me I sounded like I trusted myself. November brought the kind of cold that makes you check your pockets for small certainties. My brother called to say he'd changed his major and didn't feel like he'd betrayed anything. "I feel like I corrected a typo," he said. We laughed, and I told him that some typos are how you learn the keyboard. My grandmother called to say the frost had finally committed and the garden was asleep on purpose. My mother called to say she'd helped someone at the community center write a letter they were afraid to send. "I didn't fix it," she said. "I sat with them." I said, "That's fixing something else." December came with the usual invitations to close accounts and open expectations. We decided to keep the holidays small again. My mother brought soup, my brother brought bread, my grandmother brought stories about trains she never took and one she almost did. We ate and didn't argue and didn't make that a trophy. After dishes, my mother asked if she could read a paragraph from her notebook. It was about the day she wrote the bill and how she'd felt like she was trying to build a fence out of receipts. "I thought if I could count it, I could control it," she read. I didn't know I was counting a person. She closed the notebook and said, "That's the last time I'm writing about it." We sat with that and let it be enough. In January, I finally told the story out loud at a small community event about work and care and the ways we measure the wrong things. I didn't use names, I didn't show the bill. I talked about a kitchen table and a box and a watch that didn't keep time and a garden that did. I talked about how attention is a kind of currency that doesn't inflate if you spend it. Afterward, a man came up to me and said he'd been keeping a ledger with his son and didn't know how to stop. I said I didn't either, not exactly, but I knew you could start by changing what you write down. He nodded like he was already making room. February brought a small scare when my grandmother slipped on ice and bruised her pride more than anything else. We sat in an urgent care waiting room that smelt like disinfectant and patience, and she said, "Well, that's one way to test gravity." My mother held her hand without narrating it. My brother brought a book and read out loud in a voice that pretended not to care if anyone listened. We went home and made soup and didn't turn it into a story about fragility. March came back to the garden like a rehearsal, and we planted something sturdier again, and my grandmother said, "Let's see what it does." At work, I got asked to take on a bigger team, and I said yes, and then wrote down what I was afraid of and what I could probably do anyway. I started meetings by asking what people needed from the room. The answers were usually smaller than the silence they replaced. My mother started a habit of asking that too, in her own rooms. April brought a letter from the community center thanking her for her time, and she put it in a drawer without ceremony. "I'm trying to keep things light," she said. "Not careless, just not heavy." My brother passed his hardest class and sent me a picture of the grade like it was a postcard from a country he'd finally visited. My grandmother sent me a picture of the basil returning, stubborn as ever. May came with anniversaries that used to make me count. This time I took a walk instead and wrote in my notebook about how some numbers are really just weather. In June, I got an email from someone who'd heard my story and asked if they could share it with their mother. I said yes, and then I sat with the feeling that stories can travel without becoming invoices. My mother asked if she could come to another talk. She sat in the back and took notes about phrases she liked. Afterward, she said, "You leave doors open." I said, "You taught me that by closing the wrong ones." We laughed and didn't make it a moral. July came with light that stayed late, and I found myself staying late too, not because I had to, but because I wanted to finish something well and then leave it. My brother came over and we fixed a chair that wobbled and didn't pretend it was a metaphor. My grandmother came over and told us about a neighbor who had started keeping a ledger for gratitude and then stopped because it felt like homework. Good. Homework should end. August brought the fall trip planning again, and this time we went somewhere new, a small town with a river that moved like it was thinking. We walked and ate and didn't schedule much. One evening we sat on a bridge and watched the water argue with light. My mother said, "I don't keep score anymore." My brother said, "I keep notes." My grandmother said, "I keep seeds." I said, "I keep attention." We stayed until it got cold and then went back to the hotel and slept like people who used the day. September returned with margins, and I filled them with a class I wanted to take just because. I told my team I'd be offline one afternoon a week, and no one treated it like a crisis. My mother started a small group at the community center about money and fear and didn't bring worksheets. We talk, sometimes we cry, then we talk again. October arrived again, and I realized it had been a year since the bill had stopped being a mirror. I took the old folder and moved it to a box labeled Before and put it on a high shelf. Not because I was done with it, but because it didn't belong on my desk. On my birthday, we walked again by the river, and my mother said, "What do you want this year?" I said, "Time." She smiled like she was learning a new language. November came with another small holiday and another table that didn't try to fix anything. We said what we were grateful for and didn't keep a list. December came and we put up lights that didn't blink and took them down when we felt like it. One night my mother asked, "Do you still think of yourself as a failure?" I said, "I think of myself as unfinished." She nodded like she was relieved to be too. On New Year's Eve, my brother texted a picture of a bookshelf he'd built that stood straight this time, and my grandmother texted a picture of the garden asleep, and my mother left a voice note that said, "Thank you for letting me learn out loud." I stood at my window and watched the city practice its fireworks and wrote one last note in my notebook for the year. Progress is when you stop counting and start noticing. The bill didn't vanish from history. It didn't need to. It just stopped being the story. The story became a kitchen table that could hold silence, a box that could hold letters, a watch that kept reminding you that time is a conversation, and a family that learned to carry instead of count. And that was enough to let us breathe. The new year carried a strange sort of clarity, the kind that feels like waking up in a room you've always lived in, but finally noticing the light. I began keeping a calendar, not for tracking failures or accomplishments, but for noticing what mattered, small victories, moments of laughter, the way the city breathed around me. My mornings started with coffee and 10 minutes of writing in the notebook I'd carried for years. Some pages were messy, some were disciplined, none were evidence. They were air, space, proof that I existed without a ledger attached. At work, the team I led grew more confident, and I grew more comfortable letting them make mistakes without internalizing them as mine. A young colleague, shy and unsure, came to me one day with a project she thought was doomed. I told her, "The project isn't you, it's something you try, fail at, fix, and try again." Her eyes widened, like she had just realized someone had invented a new language, one without judgment, and I realized that what I had learned from years of careful observation, broken watches, and kitchen table conversations was finally translating. My mother called one morning and said she had a meeting with someone at the community center who had faced her same fear, that children are a debt to be repaid. She told me she'd spoken about what she'd learned from the bill, about the way she had counted me, and how she was trying to stop. I told her, "You are not a cost," she said, and for the first time I heard it not as a statement, but as a continuation of a conversation that began long ago. "I hope she believes it," she added quietly. One weekend, my grandmother suggested we all go on a small hike. My brother drove, my mother packed snacks, and my grandmother held the camera like she had the first time we went to the coast. The air was crisp, the paths were muddy, and each step felt deliberate, like walking through a memory that hadn't hardened yet. My brother tripped on a root and I caught him without thinking about the symbolic weight of it. We laughed, the sound echoing through the trees like it belonged there. At the summit, the city stretched below us, faint and luminous. My grandmother handed me a flask of tea and said, "Some views are better drunk slowly." We stood in silence, listening to the wind, letting it erase old calculations. Back at home, the small rituals continued. The basil in my grandmother's windowsill had grown into a tiny jungle, resilient and forgiving, and we harvested it with no sense of ownership, just gratitude. My mother started writing a short essay on her experiences, not for publication, but for herself, as if putting words to the page could release them from the past. She read a passage to me one evening. "I feared my child's life as a reflection of my failures. I am learning that presence, patience, and attention matter more than invoices." I nodded and said, "It's beautiful, honest." We didn't discuss redemption or blame. The words were their own remedy. At work, I faced a conflict with a vendor that might have derailed a major project a year ago. I took a deep breath and addressed it calmly without trying to prove competence or calculate blame. The conversation ended with mutual understanding, a solution neither of us expected. I realized that so much of the tension I had carried had been internal, a reflection of how I feared being counted. Each professional victory, every moment I chose to act instead of react, was a subtle reclaiming of agency that the bill had tried to quantify and the world had tried to impose. Spring arrived with longer days and softer light. I started a small writing group, inviting friends and strangers to sit and share their experiences with no judgment. One evening, a young woman read about her parents' expectations and how she had internalized them as debt. I watched the nodding faces, felt the hush of shared recognition, and realized the ripple effect of untangling one's story. My own experiences, being sent a $347,000 bill, facing my mother's fear, my grandmother's guidance, my brother's presence, had given me the vocabulary to listen without judgment. One afternoon, my mother surprised me with an old box from the attic. Inside were letters, drawings, and photographs from my childhood that she had kept. She handed me one envelope with my name in faded ink and said, "For when you need to see yourself uncounted." I opened it carefully. Inside were snapshots of birthdays, drawings I didn't remember, and notes of encouragement from teachers I had long forgotten. I felt a gentle wave of recognition. The years hadn't been lost. They had been stored, waiting for acknowledgement, for a lens that could see without evaluating. That summer, the family gathered for a small reunion at my grandmother's house. The recording of our last gathering lay untouched, and no one asked to play it. We didn't need it. The conversations flowed like old streams, stories of mistakes, recoveries, love expressed in small gestures. My mother laughed freely without calculating cost. My brother recounted a story about a broken bicycle and a lesson in patience, and my grandmother sipped her tea with the calm authority of someone who knows frost eventually melts. Later that evening, my mother pulled me aside and said, "I finally understand that every moment I feared was a measurement of you was actually a reflection of me." I held her hands and said, "And every note, every envelope, every warning, every calculation you made is now part of what guides us, not to control, but to listen." She nodded, and I felt the weight of decades lift slightly, not erased, but rearranged into something lighter, usable. The next day, I received a call from a stranger who had attended one of my talks. She had a similar story: a child labeled a burden, a parent who quantified love with bills, a grandmother who reminded her to look at growth rather than cost. She asked if I could share the methods I'd used to transform fear into attention. I shared the simplest, hardest lesson: notice, listen, respond. Do not account. I felt the strange satisfaction of someone hearing not just the story, but the method embedded in it. At work, a project milestone approached. I looked at the team, at my own reflection in the glass walls, and I realized that competence was no longer an answer to fear, but a rhythm of engagement. Mistakes were not evidence of inadequacy, successes not evidence of worthiness. They were evidence of participation, of breathing, of presence. I sent a note to my mother and grandmother, a simple, "We did it again," not perfectly, but together. Summer arrived with golden evenings that invited reflection. I planted a small garden of my own, not as a metaphor, not as an investment, but as a companion. My grandmother called and said, "The frost is learning its own pace." I sent her a photo of the sprouts. My mother called to say, "I watched you quietly, learning to measure attention, not worth." I heard the recognition in her voice, the echo of decades spent counting the wrong things. By late summer, I realized that the bill, the envelope, the recordings, and even the whispered judgments had become artifacts, not anchors. They were reminders of where we had been and how far we could carry ourselves without the tyranny of numeric value. My mother, my brother, my grandmother, and I were still learning, still stumbling, still recalibrating, but now we did so with awareness, with patience, with empathy. One quiet evening, I sat by the window with my notebook and wrote a single sentence: "Progress is when the ledger becomes a window and we choose to look through it, not tally it." My mother sent a message that said simply, "I see you." My grandmother called and said, "I see the garden." And my brother texted a picture of a sunset he had captured and wrote, "I see the sky." And in that moment, I felt the continuity of attention, the kind that surpasses bills, calculations, and fear, a presence that nurtures life itself. Autumn arrived, and with it a sense of closure without finality. The family gathered again, small, unassuming, ordinary. We laughed at mistakes and celebrated the unremarkable. I looked around and realized that love is not a sum of accounts, but a series of moments held in quiet attention. The $347,000 bill existed only as a memory, not a verdict. The envelopes, the letters, the recordings, they existed to remind us that fear is natural, but it is not destiny. We can choose how we carry it, how we respond, how we measure what truly matters. And so the story continues, not in the form of invoices or accusations, but in shared breakfasts, planted gardens, morning walks, conversations without judgment, and moments of reflection. Each day is a small rehearsal in noticing, a practice in seeing, a lesson in carrying without counting. The past remains, the wounds remain, but they are lighter, reframed, and capable of holding laughter, patience, and care. As the sun set behind the city skyline one evening, I realized that the true inheritance from my family was not a ledger, a sum, or an obligation. It was the freedom to exist without tallying, the courage to engage without expectation, and the understanding that attention and presence are the most valuable currencies of all. And in that space, I finally learned how to breathe fully alongside the people I love, unmeasured and unburdened. The months after that autumn gathering felt different, though the calendar kept its usual rhythm. There was still mornings when I woke with a pit in my stomach, a reflex from years of being counted, measured, and labeled. But now, the reflex met something else, awareness. I would take a breath, make coffee, and open my notebook, not to calculate or prove myself, but to notice. I wrote about what the wind sounded like through the city streets, the way the sun hit my grandmother's window, and the small, ordinary victories that made life feel solid, like bricks laid without coercion. Work remained a space of challenges, but the way I approached them had changed. One morning, a project that could have triggered my old anxiety came across my desk. Previously, I would have scrambled, double-checking, over-explaining, trying to anticipate mistakes before they happened. Now, I paused. I listened. I asked questions. I delegated with trust. Mistakes came, small, harmless, fixable, but they no longer landed like gavel strikes in my chest. I realized that competence is important, yes, but presence, patience, and awareness are far more enduring. I could be capable without being terrified, and I could fail without it defining me. At home, my family was thriving in subtle ways. My grandmother's garden became a tapestry of green, basil, tomatoes, wildflowers, and a few stubborn weeds that refused to be labeled as failures. She laughed at the weeds and taught us that even mistakes have their place if we tend them with care. My mother, once consumed by fear and the need to quantify love, had softened into someone who measured connection in moments, not money. She came over with soups that were imperfect but nourishing, brought stories from the community center, and sometimes sat quietly while I read or wrote. My brother had grown into himself, more confident and grounded, no longer shadowed by the weight of comparison or expectations. The three of them, and I, were learning, day by day, that family is not about invoices or tallies. It is about presence, shared time, and small gestures of care. One evening, my mother and I found ourselves alone at the kitchen table. She handed me an envelope, its paper smooth and unmarked. I paused. It wasn't labeled "cost of raising a failure" or any other judgmental phrase. Inside was a simple note: "I see you. Finally. I am learning." Her handwriting, though familiar, carried an unfamiliar weight of humility and openness. I felt tears prick my eyes. For years, I had waited for acknowledgement, for validation, for some sign that I had mattered beyond my mistakes or my productivity, and here it was, quietly, without demand, without expectation, simply recognition. I placed the note beside my notebook and realized how far we had all come. The $347,000 bill, once a looming, oppressive presence, now felt like a relic from a different life. It wasn't gone, it couldn't be erased, but it had lost its power over us. We had reframed it, not as a judgment or accusation, but as a starting point for transformation. Fear had been met with patience, control had been met with attention, and judgment had been met with understanding. And in that reframing, we found freedom. That week, we planned a small trip to the coast, a place that had been the setting for some of our earliest reconciliations and reflections. My grandmother packed her notebook, my brother packed his camera, and my mother brought the thermos she insisted on carrying everywhere. We arrived at the beach just before sunset. The sand was cool, the waves lapping quietly, and the horizon stretched endlessly, like it was holding space for everything we had endured and everything we were still becoming. We walked along the shoreline, my footprints following hers, hers following mine. For a long while, no one spoke. There was nothing to say that could make the experience any richer. Silence carried it perfectly. My grandmother stopped, knelt and picked up a piece of driftwood, smooth and curved like a question mark. "Some questions," she said softly, "don't need answers. They need to be carried." I nodded. My mother stood beside me and took a deep breath, letting the ocean wind fill the space around her. My brother crouched to capture the moment in a photograph, not as proof, but as memory. That night, back at our small rental, we cooked together. There was no assigning of tasks, no commentary about efficiency. We chopped, stirred, laughed, and occasionally burned something. My mother commented on how the flames in the oven reminded her of the fear she once carried, the fear that every action of ours was a reflection of her worth. I smiled gently. Now we just watch it cook, and we don't measure it. The laughter that followed was free, unencumbered, and I felt it stretch through me, loosening years of tension and self-doubt. In the days that followed, we continued to explore small moments of joy. My grandmother collected seashells and pressed them into her notebook, noting their imperfections. My mother tried surfing for the first time, laughing each time she fell, and my brother photographed her with the wave at her back, triumphant despite her stumbles. I walked along the water's edge alone for a while, thinking about the ledger of my childhood and the bill that had haunted me. It felt surreal that a single object could have such a long shadow, and yet here we were, together, alive, laughing, and unmeasured. Returning home, I began to notice the patterns of daily life differently. I kept my work commitments, yes, but I also kept small rituals: morning tea by the window, journaling, walking without agenda, and calling my grandmother to discuss her garden. My mother began volunteering more intentionally, not out of obligation, but from a desire to connect and help, and she shared stories from the community center, always emphasizing the human moments rather than the logistical ones. My brother continued his studies and shared his experiences without fear of judgment. We were all learning that freedom doesn't come from erasing the past, it comes from living in the present, acknowledging the past, and letting it inform but not dominate our choices. One rainy afternoon, I found myself reading through my old notebook. There, in faded ink, were pages filled with the early years of accounting myself as a burden, attempting to measure my worth through external approval. I paused at a line I had written during a particularly difficult week. "If they counted me, I would never be enough." I smiled gently. That statement was no longer true. I had learned that worth isn't something that can be itemized. It is something felt, shared, and recognized in acts of attention, love, and patience. In June, my family gathered once more, not for a celebration, not for a reconciliation, but simply to share space. My grandmother cooked, my mother brought bread, and my brother shared stories from his studies. We sat at the table and spoke without urgency, without judgment, without the weight of old expectations, and for the first time in a long time, I realized that the ledger, the bill, the criticisms, the doubts, no longer had a seat at our table. The narrative had shifted. It was no longer about failures or costs. It was about connection, presence, and the quiet power of being witnessed and acknowledged. Months later, I was invited to speak at a small community gathering about family dynamics and the ways fear and misunderstanding can manifest in harsh ways. I shared our story, not to expose anyone, but to offer a template of attention, patience, and resilience. I told the audience about the bill, the notebooks, the gardens, and the walks along the beach. I emphasize that while pain can shape us, we have the power to reshape the narrative by recognizing attention, presence, and love as measures more powerful than any ledger. People nodded, some cried quietly, and others simply held space. I realized that sharing the story out loud was not just catharsis for me, it was a way of extending the lessons we had learned to others who might still feel burdened, counted, or undervalued. Even now, as I write this story, I reflect on the journey from being labeled a failure to learning that life cannot be reduced to numbers or judgments. I have learned that the deepest wounds can be transformed through attention, patience, empathy, and quiet acts of connection. My mother, once consumed by fear and measurement, has learned to observe without tallying. My grandmother, ever wise, has reminded us that nature thrives in cycles and imperfections. My brother, growing into adulthood, continues to explore his path without the weight of our past imposed upon him. And I, having carried the burden of their judgments and my own self-doubt, have learned to breathe freely, to live attentively, and to recognize the humanity in each moment. The $347,000 bill will always exist as a reminder, not as a verdict. It marks a moment in time when fear, misunderstanding, and rigid expectation